Hi everyone, it's Bina 007 here for the second part of our And Then There Were None discussion. Just as a reminder, this is going to be full of spoilers and we are going to discuss the characters, the plot, and the adaptations. We really hope you enjoy this discussion.
Okay, so we're back. The concept of the novel, which we can now talk about fully, is that the 10 people on the island are all people who are murderers, but who cannot be convicted in a court of law because the evidence is lacking. They are killed one by one, including the two members of the staff, until at the end, one of the women hangs herself in accordance with the nursery rhyme. We discover that the person who is committing all the murders is Mr. Justice Wargrave, a retired criminal judge. He is one of the people who is apparently killed about halfway through the novel, but it is the aforementioned red herring. He had teamed up with the doctor to fake his own death and therefore could carry on murdering people, and then arranges for the final person to die. They all die. There is no redemption arc. There is no escape from this island of death. And finally, he sends his written confession off in a bottle, which is fished up by a fisherman. And that is how we find out what has happened in the epilogue. So there is, although certain of the characters try to detect who's doing the murder, there is no resolution. There's no nice bow. There is no one to explain what happened, to capture the killer and dispense justice and pat us all on the head. So that is the novel. Do you want to get a little bit into the characters, folks, or do you just want to talk about tone and the concept and
Yeah.
whether you
Well,
managed to
I,
detect it?
the only thing I wanted to add on was when you were talking about Lombard and how he wasn't a nice character. I felt that one of the things I took out of this is Christie has critiqued the whole of the British establishment in this. There's representatives from the police, the army. They've got a school ma'am here. They've got as you described it, the elderly pious spinster. They've got a doctor. And every one of them receives criticism. So it's almost like Christie is taking a swipe. And I particularly thought this with the Wargrave, like she was quite savage in the sort of the epilogue where Wargrave's saying, I like to kill and punish, so the law was perfect for me. And I thought, is Christie taking a swipe here at the sort of the treatment she's had at the hands of the British legal system herself? Because like she's been quite nasty about judges and lawyers in the past. Like we were doing the Poirot Christmas one recently, and she was talking about how they like to hide behind big flowery words and took great pleasure in trying to confuse people and things like that. And I just felt like Agatha's, taking a swipe here at the establishment. Maybe I'm reading that into it myself, but like that's one thing I took out of it that I thought, she's got on the money with some of the stuff she's saying here. So
Yeah. Bing, how did you
Sort of.
find it? This is your first novel. How did you find the plot, the characters? When you read it in middle school, did you
Oh,
figure out who was doing it? I mean, how do you
oh,
approach it now as an older person relative to then? I mean, it
right.
must have been quite a mindfuck to read it in middle school. I cannot imagine.
Well, back in middle school, I just found, first of all, my reading habits were terrible back in middle school. I would flip back and forth from the book, so I already knew who the murderer was long before I should have. So that's a totally different thing. But also, I think I liked how neatly back then I liked how neatly things wrapped up at the end, and it made sense to me. Now, when I'm sort of reading through the characters, maybe through a little bit more nuance, a little bit. It's interesting what Christie is trying to do here because I don't know not exactly quite sure, and I'm not familiar with Christie's rest of the book, so that's my problem here. But I feel like Christie is either critical of the establishment as a whole or upper society, or she's very critical of individuals that pervert the establishment at different levels. That causes problems, causes these people to have distrust towards establishment. But there is definitely a very interesting classist angle in trying to understand this book.
Well, do you want to go into that a little bit more?
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, so the whole framework, right? It's this 10 individuals, all plucked from various different sectors of high society, right? These are judges. What was it? These are judges, doctors. Marston's a young rich guy with Ferrari. Emily Brent, this headmistress. All these people fled from high society, sent to an island where they're completely separate from the rest of the world, from the rest of society. And the rest of society just look at them over there and say, these crazy people who have no idea what they're doing. And when they're all killing, when they start killing each other, all the people start saying, crazy stuff happening over there, right? It's sort of interesting to sort of see the general frame and see that disconnect, right, from two different sectors of British society.
See, I had a slightly different interpretation, maybe more similar to
cool.
Pat's, which is that it's showing all the different strata. Actually, not quite. We don't have anyone who's an aristocrat here, which sometimes we do. We get like Lord Edgware dies. We don't actually have any aristos. These people are all mostly middle class. So, okay, you've got the upper middle class, like the doctors and the judges and whatever, and the nice, rich spinsters. But then you do also have the working class people. So you've got the two, like the husband and wife, who were the cooks and the cleaners and the butlers. And you also have Vera Claythorne, who's the nursery governess, who probably wants to marry the rich guy and become middle class, but is very much working class at the time. So to me, it's almost even more of a savage indictment, because if you think about England, you've got the honest working classes and the toffs at the top, but it's the solid middle class that, the common sense middle class, the Daily Mail reading, centre right, socially conservative middle class of England. And it's almost like that's what she's satirizing and condemning, of kind of the professional people, like the people you would think of as being the kind of the stable, solid middle. So it's kind of almost worse. So to me, it's kind of upper middle class down to sort of the servants. You don't really actually see the top here in this one. But I know what you mean about, like, there's the people on the shore who all kind of think, what are these people all doing going off to this island, and eventually come and clean up the mess, I guess.
Yeah. And I think also, like, the crimes that they've committed are interesting as well, because, like, MacArthur, the retired World War One general, he's guilty of sending guys off to certain death, on a whim, because he's basically a bit jealous. And like, I'm sure that happened, like, you hear stories from World War One, and like the phrase was, British soldiers were lions led by donkeys, because some of the stupidity that took place there, which was like savagely satirized in that Blackadder series, Blackadder Goes Forth,
Right.
the idiocy was unbelievable. So, like, I'm seeing this and thinking, yeah, this can happen. And Emily Brent, who was guilty of judging that this young girl in service who got herself pregnant needed to fend for herself, and she just cast her out, at the last minute. Armstrong, the doctor, who killed a patient because he was drunk. These are all, and Bloor, who's basically corrupt. These are all people who've, like, they've committed these crimes in the course of abusing their positions of power. And I don't think these aren't things that I think people would have been surprised to read or even shocked. They wouldn't have read about this and thought, oh my God, a policeman would never take a bribe. This is incredible.
I mean, in some ways, they're quite petty crimes, aren't they? They're quite trivial in some ways.
Yeah,
Quite
I mean, some of them incredibly.
Yeah. I think
mean,
you're
the whole
right. I think they wouldn't have surprised people, which is why it's horrifying, because you can imagine it,
I mean, that's the whole point, right? Why these were people who were picked out, that these were people who were beyond the reach of the law, because they're just not quite horrible enough that there's just no laws that can specifically criminalize these people.
And in some cases, they just weren't stupid enough to be caught. Bloor committed the crime, but was clever enough to cover his tracks. And that some of them weren't seen as crimes, but others were crimes, but just the people weren't caught. So.
Yeah, and the ordinary, everyday. I mean, that's what I think is. There's so many things that are unsettling about this book. I was reading a really interesting. It's out of print now, but book by Gillian Gill, which is very interesting, on Agatha Christie. And there was another more contemporary essay that was talking about the use of the N-word in the title, and the idea that the island is actually called N-word, and then sometimes now it's renamed as Skull Island, and then became now Soldier Island, I think, and then there were none in contemporary editions. But in the original day, having that N-word in the title would have made it seem very other and very foreign and very exotic and very sinister and dark and dangerous. like playing
well,
into all those colonial exotic tropes, and that
yeah, well,
it,
they do mention that. I've been listening to a few episodes of that All About Agatha podcast
oh,
that
it's
you
a great
recommended on the
podcast.
last one,
Yeah,
and
really good.
they make that same point that the N word would have had this suggestion of otherness at the time. That
Which is probably why she kept
as
it.
we
One of the
yeah, when we try and translate this, and get rid of these racially pejorative connotations, that you still need to try and capture that if you can, which is why calling it Skull Island might be a good idea, rather than just Soldier Island, because you do
and
want
it's
to
keep that a
suggest
little
this.
bit.
Yeah.
And to me, it's the contrast between that and then these people who seem outwardly so respectable, the doctor and the school teacher and the nursery governess. It should all be very wholesome. And then it's so sinister when you realize they all have
Yeah.
these awful secrets to
Well,
hide.
even that character Marston. Like when I started reading him, I was reminded of Bertie Wooster from P.G. Woodhouse. Racing along in his motor car, and it comes out he's killed these two kids and pulled some strings with some local friends to get off with a light punishment. And you're seeing you're seeing the dark side of British society at the time. I just thought quite disturbing, really, to read. So.
Does anyone have anything else to say about specific characters before we get into the technicality of the plot?
Go ahead. Sorry.
So I had a point going back to the discussion of her views on colonialism as characterized by Lombard. The answer to that I kind of see is most of the time when I'm reading Christie, I can see how the racial slurs and things that are used are either casual and contemporary to her time, which if we're going to indict her and lock her work away for that, then we have to throw out Shakespeare and things that are important. And it's maybe not an excuse, but it's something we just sort of have to, we study history not to understand the past, we study it to understand the present. But a lot of times when I read it, I get the sense that it's very much like if you read Stephen King's The Stand and the internal monologues of some of the POV characters, they are very nasty. But I think anyone could argue validly that is a sentiment shared by King himself. He's writing these characters in the context of what is their flaw, not his. And I'm also I get the feeling that with King he would even be very uncomfortable as he wrote it, but understanding it's important for the story to have that duality of mankind. But I think you can really clue into what Agatha's feelings are on it by the fact that the order of their death is an indictment of how egregious their crime was. So
that's quite an interesting point, because I wanted to come to that. So
yeah, Marston runs down a couple of kids and is very blasé about it. Well, sucks to be them; they shouldn't have been in the road.
And he's the first one who is dealt with by Wargrave. Yeah,
right. So because Wargrave sees that there's just an absence of morality in him, and that's not really his fault. Whereas Lombard knows exactly what he's doing, and he's saved till the very end and tortured the worst for his crime, right? So I think that speaks to the author's views on the weight of these crimes.
And what did you feel about the ordering of the death and the weight of these crimes? Do you think she got it right?
Yeah, that's a good question. Do we
I
think
don't think
that Wargrave got them right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's the answer, because the thing is, I don't think you're supposed to be sympathetic to any character, especially not Wargrave. Wargrave is a psychopath.
No, yes.
I mean, at first he's just in the lower part, he's just some cold, uncaring dude who might have sentenced a guy who was not guilty to death, whatever. But in the epilogue, he becomes even worse to me, because he's an absolute psychopath.
Yeah.
And so the thing is, about getting it
I always
right.
thought Vera Claythorne was kind of harshly treated.
Yeah,
like
we've got to put a footnote on this assessment of Wargrave, because he was a respected member of the British judiciary.
Sure.
So,
I mean, so I think the thing is.
Go ahead, Bing.
Oh yeah, sorry. No, I would just point out that the order is what it is because Wargrave have this very warped sense of morality. That the people who like Marston, to me, Marston should be much later on. That guy is heinous. But
Yeah.
Same.
in Wargrave's twisted vision of the world, well, it's a young dude under influence. It's the influence's fault, I guess.
Yeah,
Not
well,
him.
I'm glad you've made that point, because I was almost thinking when I went through this and I read that epilogue that I was thinking, God, I hope this isn't Christie's order, and this is how she assesses these crimes. But
I also, yeah,
you made me see that a different way. You're saying this is Wargrave's,
yeah,
Yeah,
which
I
definitely.
hope
makes me
that's
sleep a
not
little
how,
bit easier at night. So
I
that's
hope that's
fine.
not how Christie thinks.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
I think that we can explicitly see the difference because the person who Wargrave leaves for last is Vera Claythorne. So that's
Right.
by implication the perfect person that he thinks is the most guilty. And yet, when you see the amount of space that Agatha Christie gives to Vera's POV and how sympathetically she portrays her in terms of not that what she did wasn't horrific. To kill a little boy is horrific, an innocent child, just for money, basically, and lust, basically. But the way she shows Vera being punished by her own conscience, you know, she's the opposite of psychopathic, right? It was a moment of weakness, but she absolutely is punishing herself and beating herself up to the point where she will hang herself for having done this. I think shows that Agatha Christie thinks she's much more sympathetic than Wargrave. I think Agatha Christie's ordering would be very different. I
Yeah.
think
I
I think she would have had Lombard later. And I also think the way Agatha Christie writes the unfeeling woman who turned away the pregnant servant who later then died would also have been further down the list than Vera Claythorne because she shows no remorse. And I feel that in Agatha Christie's ordering, whether you have the ability to feel remorse and to have self-awareness about the nature of your crime weighs with Agatha Christie. She will let you, or she accords sympathy to people who later feel regret.
Did you? So that was something you took out of this, that Claythorne had regret, that
Yes.
she was showing remorse rather than it didn't work and she was sorry that it didn't work.
Well, I think it's both. I mean, I think at a more superficial level, she's, you know, the moment she realizes that everyone believes her except for her lover is obviously of great sorrow. But I think there's more going on than just drat, it didn't work. I mean, I don't think
Yeah. Oh no,
that
she's
internal
definitely written
monologue
that.
and
Yeah.
she's absolutely destroyed by it, right? Whereas the prim proper spinster was like, no, I did absolutely the right thing and I won't die because I'm in the right. I mean, she's horrific. She's almost as psychopathic as Justice Wargrave because she genuinely doesn't have empathy for other human beings.
Yeah, and Wargrave seems to be aware of Claythorne's sort of mental state as well, because he puts that down in his confession at the end, doesn't he? He explains that it was an interesting psychological test to, you know, push Vera Claythorne in the way that he did, leaving her until last, you know, and almost leaving the noose there because he knew what she was going to do. So, yeah, no,
Well,
I can see that.
she gets it the worst too because she's the only one that directly involved a child. So that's always more horrific.
Marston killed too.
So this is really interesting to me because when I read it again for the podcast, so this is maybe my 5th time reading it, I've always had like a bit of a question mark as far as the Rogerses are concerned. I've always been really inclined to believe their side of it, of sort of like, we didn't kill her, but maybe we didn't take the greatest care of her either. However, in advance of this, I also watched there's a mini series done in 2015. I think it's a BBC one, but they have flashbacks to the actual crimes, and Rogers like legitimately murders her. He smothers her with a pillow, and his wife is an accessory sort of after the fact. And Wargrave seems to know that, is why she gets it a little bit easier. But that was the first time that I was like, oh, so their blatant take on it is that they're definitely guilty and there is no question mark, which I always thought the point of the story was that the problem with vigilantism is that because there is no burden of proof with a group of your peers to decide, you can get it wrong. And
I think you're right.
it's still important to follow that set of rules because you weren't in the room, and this is conjecture, and you really don't know unless you
Yeah.
get them to confess that they actually committed this
all
crime
these
this way.
all these people at Wargrave's sentence have all been convicted with hearsay. That's
Right.
basically what they've been
Yeah.
done with.
And
So
some of
I
them are
think you're right.
it's more obvious, and from their own internal monologue, you can see that it's more obvious. Okay, they are guilty, but the Rogerses remain a question mark, in my opinion. And even
Yeah.
Marsden, I mean, what he did was horrible, and he shows no remorse. But could that not be a way to compartmentalize and live with the horror of what you've done, especially as a young person? You know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
Sure. I'm much less sympathetic with Anthony Marston, but the
I'm
Rogers, I
not
do think I see
Yeah,
your
but I
point.
do think it's a good point, because I think you can read these books in different ways, and I think that the point Hannah's made about the Rogers don't get their own internal monologue where we examine the actual events. That means that's a legitimate interpretation of this book. I think that's a good way of reading it, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, and if you look at
absolutely.
like this contrast to Orient Express, right? They actually form a jury and do have a trial and come to this consensus among themselves. Whereas this is Wargrave being judge, jury, and executioner all at
Yeah.
once.
Yeah, and the big difference is Orient Express, there's no doubt as to the killer's guilt. Agatha Christie
Right.
is very clear, whereas
And
here,
so,
like you say,
yeah, they got him
mm,
as that does. So it's very interesting. And the other point I had just from the author's POV is, so this is a little over a decade after she has had her fugue state. And so it struck me for the first time reading this that you could see someone like Wargrave as an old man, and one who's dealt with, several heinous crimes and had to have a lot of experience with psychology and psychoanalysis. He would have sort of that wisdom to be able to do a character study and know what the outcome would be, and sort of move the pieces around the board, have his pawns go where he means them to. But how does Christie have that knowledge? And it struck me for the first time. I wonder if she picked up on some of this attention to detail and psychological profiling through her own experiences with therapy in the wake of that.
yeah, and bear in mind that was court ordered, right? I mean, her experience of the British justice system was pretty brutal in terms of trying to keep custody of her daughter. So no, I think that's a very valid interpretation. Okay, so we get the nuance of it's Wargrave's ordering, Christie's may be different. And I think it is interesting that you get this spectrum of people who are very proud of their crimes, see nothing wrong with them, like Lombard and the spinster, to people like the army guy who basically is waiting for death. He feels guilty. He knows it was a moment's weakness and almost welcomes it, to Vera, who finally hangs herself. I mean, it's an amazing spectrum of reactions to having committed a crime and how you might cope with that psychologically, I find. That's one of the things I find really interesting in the book. How did you guys find the technical construction of the book and the plot? Because obviously, Agatha Christie's written books like Orient Express or Roger Ackroyd that have very technically intricate plots. This is one that's seen as absolutely masterful. In her own sort of introduction to the book, she says, I had written the book 10 Little N Words because it was so difficult to do that the idea had fascinated me. 10 people had to die without it becoming ridiculous or the murderer being obvious. I wrote the book after a tremendous amount of planning, and I was pleased with what I had made of it. It was clear, straightforward, baffling, and yet had a perfectly reasonable explanation. In fact, it had to have an epilogue in order to explain it. It was well received and reviewed, but the person who was really pleased with it was myself, for I knew better than any critic how difficult it had been. I don't say it is the play or book of mine that I like best, or even that I think it is my best, but I do think in some ways that it is a better piece of craftsmanship than anything else I've written, end quote. How do you guys feel about that? The craftsmanship, the technical skill of putting the plot together. Maybe Bing, how about you? I mean, this is the Christie that you know. So
Yeah.
how do you feel about it as a puzzle book?
I think when I was in middle school, it blew my mind.
Yeah.
Which I mean, okay, awesome. But yeah, no, I think there's a lot of interesting attention to detail and that shows that she really, really sort of thought through a lot of different outcomes. I think on rereads, as an adult, you start picking up on some of the parts where she sort of start hand waving, right? And there's which honestly, you sort of have to accept in the end. Like there's some issues with how everything just came together, especially at the very beginning. Isaac Morris, the unspeaken of 11th victim, right? How is he so sure that guy wouldn't just let things slip? How is he so sure that he's not going to leave anything behind? He's the one behind everything. But apparently the guy's a perfect accountant and just keep everything shut until Wilgrave killed him. Sure. It's not necessarily a plot hole. It's a lot of hand waving. That's okay. And so, but overall, I feel like again, it's still it has a much greater audience than even maybe some of her typical books for a reason.
Yeah. How about you, Pat? How do you find the technical construction of the book?
Well, I think that one of the reasons why we get away with Agatha is getting away with what Bing calls a lot of hand waving is when she says craftsmanship. This I think is probably the best written from a technical point of view of the Christies that I've read so far as part of this reread. It's very tight. There's no flab. Like you said at the start, she doesn't waste a word. Everything's very punchy. The action is so quick. I don't think you really get time on a first read to spot flaws in the plot. It just moves so quickly. So from that point of view, technically, I think it's flawless. I'm going to borrow from the All About Agatha podcast, though, because they raised a couple of interesting points. And one of the points they made was Dashiell Hammett, who's written some great sort of noir books of this sort of genre. He said that it was very good, but he did find the one flaw that he thought Christie hadn't quite succeeded as well as she wanted to, because you get the impression that Christie is trying to keep us guessing who's responsible right until the very end.
Yeah,
but,
absolutely.
What he said is, once we hear Vera's scream, we know she's not in the room when Wargrave is shot, so it couldn't have been Vera. So we automatically have one who we know isn't dead yet, but definitely hasn't done it. And that's the only flaw that somebody like Dashiell Hammett, who was a well-respected crime writer at the time, he can find. So if somebody like him can only find that flaw, I think it's probably a testament to just how good the book is from a sort of technical construction point of view.
I mean, the one that I raised with you guys is, how did she know that there was going to be a storm that would render the island unreachable for a handy 2 days?
Well, like she doesn't. That's for me. That's almost luck, because Wargrave's already briefed all the the people in the local port, that they're not to come. It's an experiment that's being conducted, and they're to leave them all alone. And the only person who actually breaks that order is Fred Narracott, and he does it at the earliest opportunity, but only because the local scout group have got concerned with the messages that are being sent from the island. But Wargrave explains in the end, he's already told all the people in the local village to ignore any messages that come from the island, because it is a social experiment that's been conducted for a week. So I get the feeling
storm. The storm was just for added atmosphere and gothic drama, basically.
Well, it added, but they did this on the All About Agatha podcast. One of the hosts flagged up a series of problems she had with the way it was technically carried out. And as I was listening to them all, I thought, well, they're all good points, but Wargrave has planned them all, and okay, it's unlikely that they would all come off, but in this situation they have, and sometimes that happens, sometimes you take a million to one punt and it works, so I thought technically from that point of view it was quite good. The other point that they made, which I thought was interesting, and it sort of shed new light on the way I've been reading Christie's, because I'd not summed the books up this way, is they said, broadly speaking, Agatha writes two types of books for them. She writes puzzle books, which is what I think you referred to this as, and these are the ones where she drops loads of clues and you're supposed to figure out who's done it before the end. And then she writes thrillers, like the Tommy Tuppence novels, where they're just action romps. But this one was very different. It was much more noir.
I
And
This
again,
one's a good of the
I don't
two.
think this
I think
is
it's everything, actually. I think
yeah.
what makes this fascinating to me is it's a puzzle. It's an intricate puzzle novel like Orient Express or Roger Ackroyd. It's also, I think, genuinely a thriller, and you get that in that 2015 adaptation because you've got these men of action bounding around the island trying to figure out who did it. There's a gun. There are elements of thriller that come through. It's
But it
also
doesn't
a
have
gothic
the
noir.
yeah, but
You
it
know,
doesn't have the comedy elements that these more light-hearted thrillers that Christie's written do have. You know,
no,
it
but
is
she does
just so much
write. I
sharper.
mean, we haven't done them yet, really, but that she does write very straightforward thrillers, and
Yeah.
maybe we get into that as we get into World War II, because
Well,
you
the other
start
thing that
seeing more of that.
they flagged up on the podcast, which I thought was quite interesting as well, is Wargrave says that you could have figured this out at the end with the 3 clues I've given you, and one of these was the Mark of Cain, and I'm like, who the hell is going to get the Mark of Cain? You know, that's
Yeah, but you
just
have
because
to
Wargrave has
remember that.
marked the blood spot on his
No, no,
forehead.
no, no, no.
Everybody knows that
Think about it. Think about
Wargrave's
the
the guy who's
context.
responsible.
That's an impossible clue for a contemporary audience to get because we're not religious. But think about the reader in 1939. Think about how religious, how Anglican, how percentage of people going to a church service every Sunday morning. Look at those sociological surveys of England and America at the time, particularly England. Actually, I think that was a legitimate clue for the contemporary reader, if not now.
Maybe for Agatha's audience, and maybe for Agatha, but like I certainly haven't spoken to my grandparents. Like working class people from that day. I don't think they would necessarily have got the Mark of Cain. I think it would be too obscure.
I think everything in the epilogue by Wargrave to be Wargrave's own psychotic rambling.
That's a great way of describing it. Brilliant.
And the Mark of Cain just show how up his own ass he is.
Yes. Perfect.
So I as far as this, Bina always asks the question, does this play fair? And in my natural inclination is to sort of say no. But in a sense it does, because one big clue is that, well, how did we not hear the shot? There is no shot.
Yeah,
And
I think it does
as
play fair, and also because you're on the lookout for the red herring. So
Right.
I actually,
Well,
this is one of the very few Agatha Christie's that I did deduce when I read it, and I deduced that Wargrave wasn't dead and that it was Wargrave who did it. So from that perspective, I would say it does play fair because of the
gonna say one
shots and because it's a judge.
one thing that I think was sort of no, I didn't catch it the first time I read it, and probably not even the second, but by the third, one thing that always is sort of maddening to me about this whole thing is, especially when you get to, down to 7 little soldiers, is at that point, and in the 2015 adaptation, Vera is very hot on the trail, and they're sort of not listening to her. In fact, Armstrong at one point calls her hysterical. They're not really like referencing the poem and then looking out for that next thing, and I would have definitely by number 2 or 3 been like, okay, well, nobody go out to chop firewood then. And
yeah, definitely.
they're not relying as heavily on the poem as I think a group of people who are arguably somewhat fairly well educated and now on a heightened sense of alert. I mean, at one point they even say forewarned is forearmed, and they're not used as a poem. I mean, I would be walking around with a copy of it and avoiding these situations, right?
Yeah, I think the one thing from that though is like what I noticed on the reread was like Wargrave takes control of the group very early on and starts steering them, doesn't he? So
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it would have taken quite a strong personality to go against him.
Yeah.
And
I'm
also
sure you
just
would
the
have been that person,
natural
Hannah, but
and the authority
Mia
of being
more.
a judge. I think you can't underestimate just how deferential, especially in those days, people would be to someone in authority.
Right.
And he is an actual authority figure.
These people are all strong people. They're strong enough to commit murders, or at least
Well, I
weak
mean,
enough to commit murder. I mean,
I
isn't
think
it weakness as a major who gives an order to kill a love rifle? I mean, that to me is a moment of weakness. It's not a moment of strength.
yeah, I think the thing about Wargrave is that he comes across not only as authoritative but as incredibly smart. And I think like for example, Armstrong. Why did Armstrong trust Wargrave to
Yeah.
become his accomplice? Because
Yeah.
Wargrave is not
And-
only is a good, he speaks well, he's intelligent. It kind of makes sense.
Yeah, and Wargrave actually says in his confession, doesn't he? Like, I picked Armstrong because I thought he was an impressionable coward.
Yeah.
You know, he knows who to play on as well. So
Yeah.
I think this is a book as much about psychology as about just the
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Uh,
And I think Agatha Christie, as much as she's about technical plotting,
Yeah.
is often far more about psychology. I mean, Orient Express is very much about psychology. And I think that why this book lasts and why it is still like one of the best-selling novels, even in our time, is because it's not just because it's technically brilliant, it's because people find the setting gets to them, it's eerie, but also the psychology is fascinating. Who crumbles, who doesn't crumble? How do you trust one another in this environment? Is it that you kind of orient yourself towards Justice Wargrave because it's a relief that in this chaos that someone's taking charge and that you're willing to give up and just say, yes, you tell me what to think and do now, because my God, isn't it a relief that there's some order among the chaos? So I don't know.
and the other thing as well is out of the cast on the island, the person who actually figures out that it is Wargrave is Lombard. When he says to Vera, I think it's Wargrave, and he explains it because of psychology. It's quite simple. He said he's a judge. He's used to passing judgments on people and exacting justice, and that's what's going on in this situation. You know, and it's all down to figuring it out from the psychology. Like Agatha tells us halfway through the book who's done it. You know, in the voice of Lombard. You know, it's just that we get pulled off on other trails partway through. So yeah, I think the psychological aspect is definitely important.
By the time you get to the epilogue, you kind of see that Wargrave is sort of the unnatural, like Mr. Hyde to Poirot's Dr. Jekyll. You know, he's also influenced cells evil and not good. You know.
Yeah. If this was Star Trek, he would be from the Mirror Universe. He would be the Mirror Universe Poirot, definitely.
Yeah, Poirot definitely doesn't like murder, and this guy definitely does. What do you guys have anything you want to talk about that isn't to do with the adaptations?
No, I think I've covered everything I've got.
What would be your guys' order? I guess just out of curiosity.
I think that's a loaded question, and I think it's going to be a brave person who would answer it. I will say this: I think MacArthur should have been left later, because I'm sure when he sent his love rival to his certain death on that last gasp mission, it wasn't just his love rival who was condemned to death, but other men were sent out with him. Yeah. And I think he's only feeling guilty about one death, but I'm sure there were more. So I think he should have been higher on the list.
My order would have been War first and Wargrave last.
I would put Wargrave much higher up. Again, the guy to me is a psychopath. And sure, the people he's killing are way, as far as we understand, all evil. That doesn't give you the right to be the one to do it. Exactly. Especially somebody from his position who should absolutely know that. I mean, I feel like the only person I really sympathized with was Ethel Rogers, the wife, because we just don't see anything from her perspective, and she very well, like this. I think the TV series adaptation made it more blatant, but
that was a liberty.
I mean,
well, let's save it for the adaptation discussion. Right. We'll get into that.
Right, but like even in the novel, like you feel like she isn't the one who she's
has
not
no
the
real
one
agency.
Yeah.
She's just an accomplice. Okay, so before we get into adaptations, I do want to talk about the fact that this book itself is in some ways an adaptation, although we're not sure if Agatha Christie was aware of the fact that this plot concept had been used before. There was a 1913 novel called The Invisible Host by Gwen Bristow and Bruce Manning, which has a plot that very strongly resembles this one. And it was adapted into a Broadway play. There's no evidence that Christie saw the play or read the film that was produced on the back of it, but it is incredibly similar. The one that I cannot imagine she wasn't aware of is the Sherlock Holmes Study in Scarlet, which also became a film in 1933, which includes a scene where Holmes is shown a card with a hint, 6 little Indians, and does the bee stung one, and then there were 5. In this case, the rhyme refers to, quote, and this is fat phobic, 10 little fat boys, wonderful. So the film plot doesn't really resemble it, but certainly the use of the nursery rhyme. I really wonder if she got the nursery rhyme idea from that. But there we go. Anyway, let's get into the adaptations. So this is the novel that has had to date more adaptations than any other, which isn't surprising considering it's the most popular. It was received well as a novel, but as the war continued and morale was bleak, it was felt that people could not cope with the nihilism of the ending of the original novel. So Agatha Christie herself changed the ending for the stage adaptation in 1943, and in that adaptation, she has Lombard and Vera Claythorne fall in love with each other and outwit Justice Wargrave and end happily.
Yikes.
So yeah. So for Pat, that's your ray of sunshine.
Yeah, no,
And
I as much as I felt uncomfortable with the book because it's dark, I think the and then there were none with a happy ending is possibly even worse. Because it just destroys the whole concept behind the book. So
yeah, it's pretty, but I think it tells you a lot about the war and what people could take in a time of war. I think, you know, we have the privilege of saying, yes, I can read this bleak book because, you know, I'm not having to face it in daily life.
Yeah.
The first film was shot in released in 1945. It was called And Then There Were None. It was directed by René Clair, an American film director. It has the same ending as the play. Some characters have different names. Sadly, I think Vera has a different motive because I think the Vera story is one of the more interesting ones, but it's kind of broadly faithful. You can watch it on Amazon Prime Video. You can rent it for a few dollars if you want to see it. It does have quite a cool shooting style. There's lots of sort of keyhole shots and telescopes. It is quite creepy and spooky, especially towards the end. Very good expressive lighting, but it is the play ending, so it does end very happily. But I would genuinely recommend it. Has anyone else seen that? It's it's quite a famous one. It's actually, I think it's legitimately worth seeing. The next big movie adaptation, and by the way, there were TV ones in the middle of this, but I'm just focusing on the films. There's a TV version filmed in 1965, which was a British film. And even though the book is still being published with the original title, the film was called 10 Little Indians, interestingly. Directed by George Pollock and produced by Harry Alan Towers. Pollock had previously done the 4 Miss Marple film starring Margaret Rutherford, so he was known for doing sort of Agatha Christie. Weirdly, they set this up a mountain retreat in Austria. And I was watching this, my husband was in the room, and it felt like watching a jaunty Christmas movie because it's got this really kind of fun jazz score. It feels like a sort of Pink Panther film, and they're all in fluffy jumpers going up a mountain. It's absolutely hilarious. And the tone is completely bizarrely jaunty. It has got a whodunit break. So just before the reveal, the big reveal at the end, the film literally breaks off for a whodunit break where they recap the suspects to date and literally have a little clock ticker counting down 60 seconds for you to chat with your fellow audience members in the cinema about who you think did it, which is just hilarious. And it also has the ending of the play. And you can also rent that on Amazon Prime Video. I think it's insane, but it's quite good fun.
And modern cinematic storytelling has lost this art now. We don't get this anymore.
What, the whodunit break? Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
I think the one that's probably more well-known, I'd be interested to see if any of you have watched this one, is the 1974 film called And Then There Were None, which I think is the first film I watched of this. It's the first colour version of the film. It was directed by Peter Collinson, who also directed The Italian Job. So this is like, you know, a very major director. Also produced by Harry Alan Towers. And this, rather than being set up a mountain in the Austrian Alps, is set in a hotel in the Iranian desert. And it's kind of worth watching because if you've not been able to, as most people can't, travel to Persepolis and you want to see some of the phenomenal monuments in Iran, it really is lavishly filmed. It's got an absolutely crazy cast. It's got Charles Aznavour, who sings a romantic ballad. It's got Oliver Reed as Lombard. It's got Richard Attenborough as Justice Wargrave. It's got Herbert Lom in it, and the person doing the voice on the gramophone record is Orson Welles. And that's
Wow.
very widely available. So definitely worth watching. I mean, Oliver Reed is so sinister, just so perfectly cast, but also has the ending of, like, so far they've all done basically the play ending rather than the book, which is, I guess, interesting of itself. Any of you seen that one?
I've heard
No,
of it, but
I'm
I've not seen
intrigued
it.
by the cast, but
Yeah, I mean, it's just legitimately worth watching, and the setting in Iran is very, very. I mean, it's stunning, and just, no one gets permission to film there now, so it's kind of it's one of a kind. I'm guessing that the one that a lot of us have seen is the 2015 BBC serial. This was a major big deal when it came out, and then there were none. It came out over Christmas and New Year. It was big sort of event TV. It was the first one that was really following the original plot. It deliberately had a very sinister background and story to it. It shows a lot of the backstories to the murders. Because it's a serial, it has the time to do that. And it was adapted by Sarah Phelps, who also did the recent ABC murders. What do you guys think of this one, those of you who've seen it?
Well, half the cast from Game of Thrones, first of all. So there's that. We are, after all, vassals of Kingsgrave. So yeah, if you want to see Charles Dance now playing George Wargrave, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, so beautifully
Here's a question
cast,
for you:
right?
Who's worse, Tywin Lannister or Judge Wargrave?
Tywin Lannister.
I think
I mean, it's still
Wargrave.
it's definitely Tywin Lannister, given that he's
I think it's Tywin
killed
Lannister.
vast.
A lot of fans wreaks more
Yeah.
havoc on global society.
Right. Wargrave just killed 10 people at the end of the day.
And it's
So-
interesting, isn't it? Because for us as Game of Thrones fan, he's obviously the big draw towards it. But at the time, what you have to remember is our little elven friend playing Lombard was just coming off his success in Poldark. So he was very much the housewife's choice at the time.
Mhm.
So there's a very
He's the-
famous shot in the third episode where he comes out of the shower in a very low slung towel, and
I remember
it's got
that.
the heartbeat, a pacing of the entire British female public, apparently. So that I think he was probably like the big star to be in it, even more so than Charles
Aidan
Stark.
Turner, right?
Aidan Turner, yeah. This must have been, I think, before he was in The Hobbit. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But, yeah. Anyway,
Actually, no, that should be post Hobbit.
or maybe at the
I mean, all these guys are famous, right? It's
It's got
Sam Neill,
big cast.
Miranda Richardson. It's
Yeah.
Charles Dance, of course. Brendan Gorman, Mr. What was it? I forgot his famous line in Game of Thrones. Noah,
Absolutely.
all the weird
boring.
characters from season 3 are here.
Yeah.
Noah Taylor and Brendan Gorman.
But it's lovely insofar as it puts it back on an island off the coast of England.
Right.
It does have the storm. It feels very dark and grim. And apparently, because it's quite interesting when you read the novel, Agatha Christie is very particular that this is a very modern house. It's not a crusty old sort of country house. It has been modernized. And although it didn't look that modern to me when I was watching it, apparently the production designers really took the attention to detail and went back to who were the famous interior designers of 1939 and tried to sort of recreate that look. So it really was sort of no expense spared. I think it really gets the sinister atmosphere, and I really, really like this adaptation. And I think Charles Dance is perfect as Justice Walker.
Dance was awesome. I think very well acted. I feel like I also agree that they got the designs perfect. I really like the imperialism that just oozes out of from this house. Right, the weird Chinese gong that they always use.
Yes.
The various different sort of weird furnitures all across the house, all of that. That's great. I think this class, I mean, unlike Agatha Christie, the people making this series is a blatant. It can be much more explicit in the criticism of colonialism, all of that stuff. I do think they made the story a little bit less nuanced. Like I think it was mentioned earlier, I forgot it was Pat or Hannah mentioned this, but they just show Rogers straight up smothering the old lady rather than just not
Yeah,
caring
that's a
for her very
shame.
well.
That's a real shame. Yeah.
I mean, I get it; it's hard to do that in TV, but yeah, for a lot of them, it's just much more straightforward about what these people did. So it's straight up murder, and with the general as well, he just straight up pointed a gun apparently at his second in command and shot him. Which how did he get it with that back then? World War I. But yeah, I think I like that they show that all these people are not good people, and I think that's the point you really need. That's getting the original theme of the story right.
And actually, one of the things, I mean, I know they did it for crass commercial reasons, like having the little lusty moment between Vera and Lombard and the sort of like, the shirt off, was probably for just getting views and kind of social media buzz. But I like the idea of showing Vera as someone who was lustful, because that is the root cause of her criminality. And I think in the book, it's almost like Agatha Christie maybe goes too far the other way in making her sympathetic and regretful, but actually just showing that it wasn't a one-off. Like when she's teaming up with Lombard, there is an element there that you can see how she would have got into the situation, that the sort of the tendency towards being selfish and self-interested is there. I kind of really like the way they do Vera here. But yeah, there are changes, and obviously I quite like, we're Game of Thrones people, we can get into like books versus show, right? That huge debate. But it is interesting that Agatha Christie made the biggest change of all to her own book for the stage adaptation. And she, in general, had quite a good attitude towards these adaptations, that they are their own things. So I think you kind of got to let it go. I think it stands well on its own, though. I really like this. This is one of it's one of the only ones of the Sarah Phelps that I really do like.
I also like the coke scene with the one where she's just doing drugs. They're doing cocaine.
Yeah.
I don't know. It feels like something that these people would do in such a circumstance when things just
There's a
got
lot of
really
cocaine
ridiculous.
in Agatha Christie novels, right? There are a lot of drugs.
Oh
I
yeah,
mean, go read Carol at N House. I mean, this is
historically
not.
accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it was a different time. Well, maybe it wasn't actually. Everybody's doing cocaine. Anything anyone else wants to say about anything else of these
Can I
novels?
just add a little bit?
Yeah,
That
please do.
this book is incredibly popular in Japan for some reason. It has also been adapted into a TV series, which I saw a little bit of, was Sushite Daremo Inakunata, which is a straight translation of the title. Which they actually interesting. They start out with the police officers that at the end coming over to see 10 dead bodies. And then trying to unravel what happened. So that show actually came out later than the BBC. It was 2017. So I don't know if you can find a sub version of this anywhere, but it's not bad. Also,
Christie's quite popular in Japan as well. I've been reading that there's been quite a few of the Poirots have been very popular in Japan.
That's true.
In the last 10 years or so as well. So
also maybe even a bigger impact culturally in Japan of this book specifically, the name UN Owen, which is what Wargrave uses as the disguise of the person inviting everyone, i.e. unknown. That name was then later used by the maker of the video game Toho Project. Which is this side-scrolling shooter game that has spawned its own massive franchise, including music, all sorts of fun, lots of stuff. But the name UNON is sort of one of the central themes in that franchise. And also, finally, there's also a very famous anime / game series called When They Cry, which is also sort of a mystery series, and this one specifically called Wumi Neko when they cry. So when the black cats cry or whatever. But it's a very similar sort of setting in which a bunch of people gets locked up in an island and they have to sort of solve a bunch of murders before everyone dies.
I will try and check those out, or at least try.
So you know how I can't remember which one it is, but Prowo says something in a previous book about, well, what if there was a murder and, you were locked in the room with him, and alluding to cards on the table, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is a line fairly early on in this book. I won't say what it is, but it is sort of it's the equivalent of that to Crooked House.
Yes.
And when we get,
a nice setup.
Do you know what I'm talking about, Bina? When we get to Crooked House, I'll say what
I do. We must, yeah. I love that book. So.
It's Crooked House.
Yeah. So hopefully you all enjoyed, I don't know if that's the right word, this discussion of And Then There Were None. Hopefully it provoked you to think deeply about social attitudes, racial attitudes. We would, if you haven't read it and have listened anyway, please, I would encourage you to read this book. It really is it's so unique and so strange, even within the context of Christie's own oeuvre. The next book that we will be covering in the reread is a very different beast. It is Sad Cyprus, which was also published in 1940, and it's I think a really fascinating Hercule Poirot mystery maybe more conventional in part of Agatha Christie's works, and maybe still quite dark, I think, but maybe not quite as dark as this one. So a bit of relief after this. But thank you for joining, Hannah and Bing and Pat, because this was a really great discussion.
As always, thank you for putting it together, Bina.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to interlope.
Yeah.
Oh,
Thanks
that's
very
okay,
much.
Bing. If there are any others that you love and you want to jump on for, do, because it was really
Yeah,
great.
it's been great having you on, Bing. Yeah,
Yeah,
brilliant.
thank you.
Yeah, definitely, check out Crooked House, check out Endless Night, and join us for those. I really think you'll enjoy them if you're not a fan of the straightforward prose or the marbles.
Yeah, honestly,
They're
mate, if you love this and it blew your mind, you should, when we get there, please try and join us for Crooked House. Just try and grab a copy and have a read. I think you'll love it.
We'll see about
And
that.
Endless
But
Night is just so
No pressure. No pressure.
Endless Night is the most different one. It's like if you didn't know better, you'd think somebody else entirely wrote it.
Yeah.
And it's quite something.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, guys. I'm going to duck out.
Me too.
Okay.
But have a good
Good
evening,
to
guys.
see you.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Bye.
You guys, bye-bye.
Thank you.